Hello. So this video is going to be a little bit different than what I normally do. As many of you will know, normally on this channel I analyze a particular text, but I've gotten a request to do a video about free will versus determinism and the moral implications of those two positions. So this is going to be a bit more of a philosophy video. Now, I'm not a philosopher by training. I've read a decent amount of philosophy. I did study some contemporary debates about free will versus determinism for an article I recently wrote. But this is not by and large my field. So what I'm going to say is going to be fairly broad, fairly general. I'm not necessarily delving into anything new or presenting a new perspective. The other thing I think that's important as a sort of preliminary discussion is for me to sort of address my own positionality with this. Free will versus determinism is largely, though not exclusively, a theologically oriented debate. The idea of determinism traditionally, especially in the Abrahamic tradition, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, the idea of determinism basically comes from the idea of God's divine plan. That being said, many pagan traditions like Greco-Roman mythology, Norse mythology, etc., these also had a concept of fate, the idea that human life or the trajectory of the universe was divinely mandated or in some way foreseeable by the gods, whether that was like Zeus or Prometheus or Jupiter in the Roman tradition, whatever it was. So this tends to be a theologically oriented issue. I call myself a polytheist agnostic, in the sense that I don't know whether there are gods or a god or deities of some sort. I simply don't know, and so I don't take a position on it in ontological terms. The sort of question of whether or not a divine being or beings actually exists, I don't take a position on it because I don't know. So my starting point for entering the free will versus determinism debate is not necessarily to assume that there is some sort of divine plan. Now, in order to really get into the question of free will versus determinism, we first need to figure out what both of these terms mean. And that may be deceptive in terms of it seems quite simple, right? So determinism, generally, on the sort of surface level, basically means there's a plan for the universe. Our actions are predetermined, hence determinism. The universe is unfolding in the way that it should, and there is some sort of force or entity or something that has determined everything that's going to happen ahead of time. Now, one potential hiccup here becomes, what is the nature of that plan, right? Do you say, because there is some sort of divine cosmic universal plan, that there must be a planner, and there must therefore be some sort of deity or deities who have come up with the plan for the universe and just foreseen everything that's ever going to occur? Or do you take a more abstract approach and say, no, the universe itself as a non-thinking, non-feeling entity has determined what's going to happen? And is that determination then conscious, or is that determination then more probabilistic? Maybe. That may not be the right term, but is the determination of what is going to happen based on, say, the laws of physics that exist within this universe? Only certain things are going to happen because of an infinite number of competing forces and elements and decisions and whatever it is that mean that only this thing can happen. At which point you don't need a deity or deities of any sort. You simply have the universe deciding, whether the universe is deciding as though the universe itself is a conscious being making choices, or whether the universe happens to function according to certain laws, and those laws determine everything. The other thing in terms of determinism that's problematic is the question, does the divine planner, and this question does come down to the question of having a divine planner. Does the divine planner set the plan or simply see the plan? So in Jewish, Christian, Islamic theology, God, Yahweh, Allah, whatever it is, sets the plan. God has decided, here is all the stuff that's ever going to happen in the universe. I have chosen it. I have the power, the authority, the ability to do so. On the other hand, you take a figure like Prometheus from Greek mythology. He is able to see the future. He has preternatural knowledge, but he doesn't decide what happens. He doesn't set the course of things that are going to occur. He simply knows what's going to happen. So which of these versions of determinism do you want to work with? The version in which God has a plan, the standard cliche for anyone in grief. God has a plan, God has a purpose, God has done this for a reason. Or the universe is unfolding as it should approach, in which things happen, they are foreseeable, but they aren't enforced by the being that foresees them. So you've got a lot of distinctions within determinism, but then the same thing occurs within free will. Now, the way we would tend to gloss free will, I think if you stopped most people on the street and said to them, what does free will mean? They would say something along the lines of being able to make choices or to do what I want without being constrained. So in philosophical terms and theological terms, this, of course, excludes physical stuff in the world, right? Like if someone puts a gun to my head and says, give me ownership of your cat or I'll shoot you in the head, then I'm being constrained there, right? My choice to give up ownership of Frank is constrained by external forces. Philosophically, that's not interesting. Ethically, it may be interesting whether or not blackmail can ever be justified, but that's a very different issue. That's not an issue of free will. Similarly, if my partner and I decide that we want to go out to a particular restaurant and that restaurant is closed, it is not a constraint on our free will that we cannot eat there. So sort of physical stuff in the world obviously excluded from issues of free will. So the question becomes, on a theoretical level, do we have the ability to make unconstrained choices within the world? What exactly does that mean? Partially, it depends to a certain extent on your definition of determinism, because if you say, well, the laws of physics have made certain things the most likely result of everything else that's occurred in the past, then free will is possible, right? I mean, we can make unconstrained... to be clearer here, free will is possible within the bounds of a limited set of possibilities, right? Because everything that's occurred in the history of the universe since the Big Bang has led to this particular choice, and that's always true of every choice, theoretically. And so there's only a certain set of possibilities open to me. My choice is constrained, but I get to make a choice amongst the possibilities. On the other hand, if you take a more sort of hardline deterministic approach and say, nope, there is a God or gods who make choices and they force the universe to proceed in a certain way through their will, then it's much harder to make the argument that I have unconstrained choice, because my choices are always predetermined. They are constrained by a deity. So the question here, in terms of understanding free will, becomes, what does it mean to make an unconstrained choice, right? I can't choose to levitate to work. I don't physically have that capability. Does that mean that my free will is constrained? Or does free will have to be understood in a more narrow sense of, like, I chose to wear this tie as opposed to a different tie. I chose to apply to this job at Penn State, and maybe I didn't apply to a different job. Or that's actually probably a bad example because I've applied to a lot of jobs, but you get what I'm saying here. Like, I've chosen to do this thing where I had the option to do this other thing. Now, there is also a contemporary debate, a non-theological debate around free will, and that has to do with neuroscience. And this was what I was recently reading about, because there is cutting-edge neurological research that has basically sort of mapped reactions in the brain. And one of the things that scientists have determined is that a split second, less than a split second, whatever it is, before you consciously make a decision about something, your brain, the neurons in your brain have already said, all right, here's what we're doing. So there is a disconnect between the conscious choice and the biological, physiological activity that your brain chemistry goes through. Some people have argued that this means that free will is largely an illusion. We are constrained, or our decisions are determined not by our own conscious choices, but by the sort of physiological activity of the meat in our skull. To me, I find this unconvincing as an argument. I think this is a distinction without a difference, because in a way, it really depends on Cartesian dualism. This idea that there is a difference between the consciousness, the awareness, the who I am as a sort of abstract being, the soul in theological terms, versus the meat and bone and sinew and fluids of my physical body. I don't know that that's a meaningful distinction if you're coming down to the level of neuroscience to try and determine whether or not free will exists. I mean, the idea that my brain synapses have made a decision, therefore I haven't made the decision, that to me is kind of a pointless distinction, right? Like, I get the distinction that's being made there between consciousness and physiology. But in order to say I don't have free will because my physical brain has made the choice, you kind of have to accept the premise that my physical brain is not me. And I don't necessarily buy that. So that's definitions and stuff. That's sort of what each of these terms mean. And I know that's not a clear, simple definition for each of them. The problem is you can't have a clear definition of this is what determinism means, this is what free will means. It really depends on what people are talking about, how people are framing the discussion, how they understand each of these terms. So, most people, intuitively, I think, see free will and determinism as mutually exclusive. That is, if there is a divine plan for the universe where everything is set in advance, then I can't make free choices because any choice that I make is what's going to have already been decided. And my choice is always constrained. I will always make the choice that was already determined. Therefore, I don't really have freedom. I don't really have the ability to choose. I couldn't choose, for instance, something that is not part of the divine plan. So they're mutually exclusive. And then if there's a divine plan, the other direction. If there's free will, you can't really have a divine plan. Most people, I think, would intuitively agree. Like, if I can make a choice, if I can choose between two options, the simplest choice you can have, I can choose between two options. Both of them can't be part of the divine plan because I can only choose one of them. This, of course, ignores options in which you can make multiple choices. But at this point, at this one specific point in time, I can choose two things that become mutually exclusive. They both can't be part of the divine plan. If I choose option A, I can't choose option B, and so option B is not part of the divine plan. But if I'm free to make that choice, then there can't be a divine plan. Some people have tried to get around this apparent contradiction in various ways. One of which is basically a sort of version of, well, the divine plan is contingent on choices that are made, which I think most people would agree that kneecaps it being a divine plan, right? So if I choose A as opposed to B, then the divine plan accounts for me choosing A, and then it goes off in a direction. This, again, seems like it eliminates the divine plan element and says, okay, then you're just looking at the current situation and estimating what's going to occur, but you can never go very far down the line because there will be another choice. So I've chosen A, gone off, and now I've got choice C and D. And based on me choosing A, you can't establish that I'm going to choose either C or D. You don't know which one I'll pick. So they seem to be mutually. So this explanation, I think, is remarkably unconvincing to me, because it tries to preserve the idea of the divine plan by sacrificing the divine plan. Another argument, often theological, that I've seen is that free will and determinism are not mutually exclusive because they exist at two different cosmological levels of truth. So from the human perspective, we have free will, right? I can choose this tie or a different tie. I can choose whether or not I want to go to a restaurant or order pizza or eat something I cook, whatever it is. On the other hand, there is the level of God. And this is, I've seen this typically in a Judeo-Christian Islamic discourse. On the other hand, there is the level of God, at which God has a divine plan, but because it hasn't been revealed to humanity as such, we don't know. We don't know it. So at the level of God, determinism is true. At the level of humanity, free will is true. I think this is still problematic. This is a dodge for me, and this one kneecaps free will, because sure, I may experience my choices as free, but if they are actually constrained by a higher power, then they still aren't free, even if I experience them as free. There's a question posed in an episode of Doctor Who. Is a slave if he doesn't know that he's a slave? And the Doctor's answer is yes, immediately. So that becomes the thing, right? Is like, if my choices are constrained, even though I don't know that that constraint exists, my choices are still constrained. I'm still limited in what I can choose to do because there is no way for me to choose otherwise, even if I'm not aware that I couldn't choose otherwise. So these are the contradictions. I think you've got a version of it that I'm familiar with. And again, this is based just on what I'm familiar with. There are tons and tons and tons of philosophers have talked about free will versus determinism. Theologians have tried to reconcile them. Non-theological philosophers have pulled them apart or tried to reconcile them. But the two main strands that I'm familiar with as someone who's not a specialist in this area, again, are, well, the divine plan is just very short term, which means there's no real divine plan, or we have free will because we don't know what the divine plan is, which again destroys the idea of free will because it assumes that will is free if we don't know that it's constrained, which is problematic, I think, in terms of a genuine understanding of free will as such. Now, if you're theologically happy with either of those explanations, great, bully for you. Personally, I'm not satisfied by them, but that doesn't mean anything for you necessarily. But the other aspect that I was asked to talk about in this video is the moral implications for free will versus determinism. And I want to try and make this short because this video is getting a bit lengthy, but the basic sort of problem that tends to crop up in moral terms is the question of guilt, right? Because if I do something in a deterministic universe where I could not have chosen to do anything else, I was always constrained to have done that, am I guilty? If you have a universe in which free will is real, there is no divine plan, there are possibilities, probabilities of what's more or less likely to occur in the future, but nothing constrains my choices, then I have guilt, right? If I run a red light, I've chosen to do that. I am guilty of doing that thing in a free will driven universe. Whereas if I'm in a deterministic universe, then it was decided before, maybe even at the beginning of the universe, pre-Big Bang, perhaps, that I was going to run that stop sign or that stoplight, and I never could have done anything else. So how can I be guilty? My action was not chosen by me, and so in that sense, I shouldn't be held morally responsible. Theologically, this often gets debated around figures like Adam and Eve or Judas in the New Testament. Adam and Eve, obviously, in the book of Genesis. If Adam and Eve were fated to eat the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, is it fair that God punishes them? If God chose to have them do this thing, and they couldn't have not done it, they don't really have free will, right? If they had to, if the cosmological unfolding of the universe in Jewish, Christian, and I think as well Islamic theology depends on the fall of Adam, Adam couldn't choose not to fall, could he? He had to eat the fruit. Adam and Eve had to eat the fruit and be expelled from Eden because that is what God's plan relied on. The same thing applies with Judas, right? In Christian theology, the salvation of the world depends on Christ's crucifixion and subsequent resurrection, the conquest of death. Without that crucifixion, the whole opera falls apart. You can't have the salvation of humanity through Christ's death and resurrection if Christ doesn't die. Therefore, he needs to die. Judas needs to sell Christ to Caiaphas. You can't get around it. You have to have that occur in a deterministic universe. And therefore, is it fair? Is it just to punish Judas with an eternity in hell for doing a thing that God decided he was going to do, that Judas couldn't have chosen not to do? Now, these become sort of abstract philosophical questions when we're thinking about theological figures, when we're thinking about biblical characters, people, they're not historically real. Judas might have been historically real. Adam and Eve weren't. I'll go out and say that directly. You can at me in the comments if you want. But so this becomes the big problem. But it, I think, becomes much more difficult when we start thinking about it in sort of practical, real-world terms, right? If Charles Manson could not have done anything other than become a cult leader and send his cult followers to murder people, is it morally just of us to hold him responsible for that? But then the next question becomes, if he was fated to do that, if he could not have avoided doing that, doesn't it follow that we couldn't have avoided holding him responsible? That literally whatever happens is what was always going to happen. And so in this sense, it's sort of, I don't know, the question of guilt or innocence becomes so muddied that it's very easy to see how this could lead to a sort of nihilistic spiral of, well, no one is ever responsible for anything, therefore we can't do anything, but even if we don't do anything, we're still choosing not to do anything, so we're still making a choice, and we haven't really made that choice, and my world is collapsing in on me, right? At the same time, I think what it ultimately sort of comes down to in terms of the question of moral and practical implications is it doesn't really matter that much if determinism is true. We as human beings existing within the world have to behave as though free will is true, right? We have to behave as though we get to make choices, because if we behave as though there is a divine plan, how does that actually alter any of our behaviors? The one way I can immediately see it potentially altering our behaviors is if we decide that whatever it is that we want to do is the divine plan, and therefore we can follow our worst impulses without guilt. That actually becomes a major problem. And in a way, this is actually, so the Ranters were a group of Christian dissidents during the English Civil War, really, really fascinating group. Basically, they were like, God is everywhere, which means God is in us. We are God. God can't sin. Therefore, whatever we do is not sinful. And so they were like, let's drink, let's eat, let's celebrate, let's have sex, let's listen to music, whatever it is. And when that's your perspective, when that's your goal, sure, great, go for it. 10 out of 10, love it. On the other hand, when your perspective is God is in me, I am God, nothing I do can be sinful or bad, therefore I can commit genocide. Oh, that's a different kettle of horses. Yeah, no, don't like that. So this becomes one of the things. I think in practice, we have to exist as though free will is the reality because we don't know the divine plan. The problem becomes when you have people who think that they know the divine plan or claim that they know the divine plan and use that as justification for their own morally reprehensible actions. Because again, this is the pitfall of determinism in terms of guilt and innocence. If I was predestined to do it and I couldn't have chosen otherwise, I'm morally off the hook. I'm not a bad person because God or the fates or the universe or whatever decided I was going to do bad things, whether I want to or not.